They're a little creepy, a little kooky, maybe a bit mysterious and sort of spooky, but we never call them ooky. Of all of Hollywood's movie families, and there are a lot of them, we find the Addams Family to be the most relatable and, in many ways, functional. In a world of falsities and follies, they embrace who they are and what they cherish. And that's not something that we would call typical, but we would definitely call it commendable. And yet, there are other reasons we adore the Addams Family and the Addams Family values, besides the amazing characters. Locations, sets, set decoration, colors. Every single piece of each moment of the films is abundant with detail.
Showtime!
This serves multiple purposes. It introduces and develops the characters, it facilitates the plot and comedic moments, and, most importantly, it pays homage to the original single-panel comic format, created by Charles Addams in 1938, and which appeared frequently in The New Yorker.
He has my father's eyes.
Gomez, take those out of his mouth.
Our favorite movie family of all time is a little different. And when it came to hiring a director to bring the world to life, producer Scott Rudin knew that playing it safe with a typical comedy director wouldn't do the movie, nor the source material, any justice. He knew that cinematographer Barry Sonnenfeld had the perfect eye to see this movie family come to life. But before we dive in, take a look below, and if you're into our channel, hit the like and subscribe button. Like each panel of the comic, every scene in these films tells us a story, starting with the opening sequence of the first film. The carolers are vivid against the monochromatic house, decked in a typical Christmas color scheme, which didn't even make its way into the black holiday wreath on the door. As we pan up, we see that the wood siding is worn. The house clearly hasn't been repainted in some time, and the window shades are disorderly. Whoever lives here embraces imperfection and wear, respects history and honesty, and doesn't care about outward appearance. Then we get our first glimpse of the Addamses, pale and monochromatic, the obviously nonconformist family who are about to dump a cauldron of boiling tar on the carolers. The comedic nature of the scene oddly doesn't make us fearful of the family or feel that they're necessarily hostile or cruel, but almost has us siding with their mockery of the traditional and mundane.
Oh no. He lives.
The first scene is straight from the comic strip, the perfect way to not only connect the media, but to show us exactly who these people are not 2 minutes into the film.
We're Addamses.
And that's not the only one. There is scene, after scene, after scene, after scene, after scene, after scene, after scene. Well, you get the point. But the movies aren't recreations of the comic panels, although they do take a nod from the notion of vignettes. The Addams mansion is full of them in the form of the rooms and the scenes that occur within. For each character's individual spaces, there are elements that illustrate their personalities, which are very distinctive, but also part of a bigger cohesive whole. This was, of course, the intention when the first film's production designer, Richard MacDonald, decided to illustrate the family as aristocrats, beyond old and new money, but instead unique individuals living their own lives within a family unit. The Addamses are a collection of dreamers who live in a bubble of fun and youthfulness, enjoyment of life, fantasy, their own unique hobbies, with their own unique diversions, personal idiosyncrasies, serious interests. The overall tones, materials, and spatial proportions and flow of the house is continuous throughout the common areas as well. MacDonald wanted to really separate the family from the outside world, not just in their individual appearances, but also in their environment. He did this by selecting a palette of rich browns and blacks that really give weight and sturdiness to the house, as well as lighter colors that give way to more tonal variation rather than being too polychromatic, as we see in the spaces and places in the outside world. He also selected sumptuous and natural materials throughout the mansion, various wood types, tones, patterns, heavy materials, opulent glasswork. It's worn, peeling, dirty, covered in dust and cobwebs. Lurch is making a slow but dedicated effort to keep up with the housework, but there's no sense of shame in the state of things, nor that of an obligation to keep up with them. After all, it's merely appearances, and what do the Addamses care about such things?
Who are you?
What are you? Who moved the rock?
Meanwhile, the real world is full of cheaper materials and textures, which MacDonald purposely selected to reflect the idea of mass production and lack of class in the real world, as well as to give the sense that they have to stand up to heavy use. And then there's the scale of the house with one space flowing to the next. On the interior, the rooms are large with high ceilings and enough space to center the furniture, creating a sense of grandeur and luxury that's lacking in most everyday homes. There was a big effort to differentiate from the aesthetic of the TV show. In addition to the larger design choices, there are little special details everywhere. A plant that shrivels in the sun in Gomez and Morticia's room. Priceless works of art and a still somewhat alive frog in the corridor to Gomez's office. Souvenirs from dark tourism spots in Fester's room, not to mention the trunk of weaponry he brought along. A trapdoor for escape in Wednesday's room. The water tube in Pugsley's room that leads from the chain room to trapdoors on the exterior. The cemetery is full of Art Deco-style sculptures, a la Henry Moore circa the 1930s. The grand ballroom is reminiscent of grand buildings from the Victorian era, like the Crystal Palace. Then there's the exterior of the house. In researching, MacDonald noted that in the comics, the house is always different. It varies in height, width, depths of its volumes, etc. It's, quote, never the same house twice, end quote. So he created a literal napkin sketch of the house as direction for the location scouts, who, after scouring the East Coast, determined that they would simply have to build the facade. And so they did, on a hill overlooking Burbank. The decision to build high above anything was so that the house would have a plain background in shots, just the sky, so that it would look isolated and separated from the rest of the world. The choices that MacDonald made for the first film dictate the direction of the visual aesthetic for both. However, when Ken Adam, no relation, took the reins on the second film, the overall color tones, values, aesthetic is maintained, but there are some noticeable differences. We see some of this on the exterior. The conservatory changes shape and no longer has a walkable rooftop. The overall roofline changes and is somewhat simplified. The entry becomes a little bit more porch-like. The cemetery is simpler, and yet in some shots more vast, as is the landscape around the house. To see additional differences, we'll have to travel back inside. The foyer, which is smaller in scale, is missing the elaborate burst pattern on the floor and has a single-run staircase rather than the imperial staircase from the first film. The door to the ballroom is gone. The living room is mostly the same, with the most obvious difference being the furniture. Gone are the library overflowing with books, Gomez's weapon-ridden office, the chain room, and the vault, or any mention of it. But there's a great addition, Pubert's nursery, which incredibly morphs as the story progresses.
My baby!
The stress of Fester being lustfully ensnared by Debbie and the kids being sent off to what can only be described as some version of hell for them. Not only was Ken Adam trying to create some distinction between MacDonald's designs and his own, but he was trying to bring the house back to a more true reflection of the comics, rather than an inspired interpretation. After all, in the comics, the house was always different. In both films, the mansion, isolated in its desolate landscape, is a perfect environment for the Addamses to live their quirky lives without interference from the real world and its strange people and customs. But, like all of us introverts, they have to interact with the real world sometimes. It's when we see them in these settings and how they interact with one another, despite standing out from the crowd, that we understand how incredibly solid their family bond really is, and just how different they truly are. Because if we were left immersed in the estate with such relatable characters, we lose any sense of why they are creepy, kooky, mysterious, and all that. It's when they venture out and interact with the quote-unquote real world that we are reminded about how unique they actually are. Look at Debbie's not-so-humble, at all, abode. It's bright and very white overall, with some very colorful contrasts.
But, Debbie, what? Pastels?
It's grand and opulent, but not tastefully. She clearly needs to show off her wealth.
These are beautiful things. They're from catalogs.
Let's just say it. It's tacky. It's cold. It's too much. Just like Debbie. We love her, by the way. And no matter how much she's tried to integrate Fester into her reality, he will always be an Addams. One of the most endearing things, at least to us, about the Addamses is that they never allow the outside world to sway them or overshadow them. And they always bring their quirkiness with them wherever they go. To the jobs they're forced to obtain in the first movie, to the motel itself that they're forced to live within, to Camp Chippewa. with minimal but perfectly charming sets built in the Sequoia National Forest.
How charming.
Camp Chippewa is one of our favorite locations. Its bright, fresh outdoor setting full of romping blonde children is the perfect contradiction to the Addamses, especially Wednesday and Pugsley. But as horrible as the other campers are,
Hi, I'm Amanda Bachman. I'll buy a cup if you buy a box of my delicious Girl Scout cookies.
as horrible as the forced camp activities are,
Is that your bathing suit? Is that your overbite?
as horrible as leadership is,
Because that's what being privileged is all about!
as horrible as imposed joy is, they find a way to make it their own.
Children! Can't stop it! You're destroying my text!
Both Addams Family films breathe incredible life into Charles S. Addams' original comic with their clever writing, wonderfully developed characters, rich and distinguishable sets, and comedic touches.
Isn't he a lady killer?
Acquitted.
They remind us to celebrate what makes us unique, to throw away the conventional and embrace the weird and the macabre. It reminds us that we're all a little bit strange inside, no matter how normal we want to appear to the rest of the world.
Our whole family, together at last. 3 generations. Above ground.
Thanks for watching. Is there anything you'd like to add? Any films you'd like for us to cover? Leave a comment down below. And if you enjoyed this video, be sure to check out our others. Give us a like, a subscribe, and follow CineStructure on social media.